Hi everyone, today I'm going to show you how to handle screen orientation in your Expo React Native apps. So first off, we're going to start off by creating our Expo app, and we're just going to run this command npx create Expo app, and we're going to use the blank template. You can use any template you want, but for my purposes this is the one I'm going to use. I'll give my app a name, and it's going to just be Orientation Expo Tutorial. And then I can go ahead and change into the directory that's created for that app. And then I'm going to go ahead and install the screen orientation package. That's going to be used to check the screen orientation lock, and also unlock and lock the screen orientation. Cool, that's installed. Now I can go ahead and open up the code. I'm going to use this command that I've set up. Going to head over to my app.json. So here I'm going to configure my config plugin, because the screen orientation is a config plugin. It requires full screen as true, so I'm going to go ahead and set that. You could try it without this, but I'm assuming that it has something to do with the iPad, so it might be worth keeping that just to make sure that it functions correctly. And then I'm going to go ahead and add my plugin section. So I've just copy and pasted this across, and I'm going to set my initial orientation to landscape. So it defaults to landscape when I open the app. Then I'm going to go ahead and run this EAS build configure command. This will allow me to build a standalone version of the app that I can then run in dev mode with the dev client, and that will mean that I can test the screen orientation. I'm going to add a section here for iOS that says simulator true, so I can go ahead and install this on the simulator. Now that's done, I can head over to my command line and I'll type the command in to actually start the build for this development profile. So I go EAS build, platform is iOS, and then I want the profile, which is going to be development. If I were to do this for production, I've obviously use production. It's going to ask me if I want to install Expo Dev Client. Because I haven't already, I'm just going to select yes. It's going to go ahead and start off, and I haven't got a bundle identifier in the app.json, so it requests what I want that to be and sets that all up. Then uploads the build, and it'll take a while to build. So while that's running, I usually go ahead and start my Android build as well. So it's the same command, except for platform I want Android. I usually like to just get these both running so they can be ready as soon as possible. I do them at the beginning so I can develop in my standalone app. You can use Expo Go for a while if you're using features that aren't related to the config plugin, but I'm wanting to demo the config plugin, so I need the standalone app. So my standalone app is built, so I've dragged it across, and I'm going to go ahead and run npx expo start -- dev client. That will run it with that dev client that I've just installed. I'll hit I so that it opens up. And you can see here that it's in landscape mode, which is what I specified in the app.json file. Now I'm going to go ahead and import a couple of things. I'm going to import use effect, which is going to be used to basically check what orientation and orientation lock I have. And I'm going to use import use state, which I can use to basically have the UI update if the state changes. So I'm just going to set it to undefined initially, and when it's undefined I'll show loading, and when it's set, then I know that I've loaded the orientation. So I'll check orientation, and I'm going to display the orientation if it exists. So I'm just going to have this here. I'm going to have text for orientation and text for orientation lock as well. I'm going to store the orientation in orientation.value and the lock in orientation.lock. Just going to make this quite explicit and make it say lock. And if there is no orientation, then what I'm going to want to display is the text that it's loading. If I go ahead and save that and open up my simulator, you can see loading because I haven't actually done anything to set that orientation. You can see when I'm landscape, it displays correctly because I've got that initial state set to landscape. Now I'm going to want to import star as screen orientation from that Expo orientation, screen orientation package that I've already installed. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up my use effect. Basically this is a function that's going to be called when my page first loads, and I've got no dependencies specified in that list, so it's only going to be called once. And the return of this function will also do any cleanup that's related to any listeners I set up, because I will be setting up some listeners soon. But first off, I'm just going to go ahead and get that actual orientation. So I'm setting up my get orientation function, and I'm going to go ahead and call the screen orientation .get orientation async, and also get orientation lock async. So this is going to make this function asynchronous. So you can see I've got the awaits. And once I've got those values, I'm going to go ahead and call set orientation and pass it this orientation object, and that's going to be set in that state variable orientation and will trigger updates to the UI. So I've got the value and I've also got the lock. Now you can see that didn't actually update that loading, and that's because I haven't actually called this function yet, so let's go ahead and call it. Awesome, now you can see the orientation and the lock, but you can see it doesn't update when I rotate around. In order to have it update when we rotate around, we're going to need to add some listeners to that orientation changing. So I'm now going to set up the orientation change listeners. I'm going to keep a reference of this so I can also unsubscribe from it. I'm going to pass the function that I want to call when the orientation changes. And here in the return statement, it's going to do cleanup that would happen when this page unmounts. So I'm going to go remove orientation change listener and pass in that orientation change sub that I got from adding my orientation change listener. Now I'm going to need to go ahead and define my function orientation changed. It's going to get some results from the orientation change. And I can use those results to set the orientation. If you were doing this and you weren't sure what that format of the results would be, you could console log it and check what the values are before going ahead and setting your orientation state variable. So I'm setting the value and the lock from the results. Cool, and now I've saved that and I can rotate. You can see that orientation changes. The orientation lock doesn't change because I'm not changing how it's locked. So now I'm going to go ahead and add an unlock and lock button. I'm going to put those in a view because I'm going to show you how you can adjust the layout of things based on the change in orientation very soon. And this will just be a simple case. You might have more complex cases where you want to like swap out a whole layout for something new. But this is just going to be a simple example of how you might change layout. So I'm going to call this screen orientation.lock async and specify how I want to lock it using this orientation lock, and I'm going to set landscape. You can see those are like enums with associated values that basically are what is represented in my UI at the moment when I change my rotation. I'm also going to have my unlock button. And my on-press for this is just going to be a little bit simpler. It's still an async function, but it's just going to call unlock async. And that's all I need in terms of buttons. Okay, opening it up, you can sort of see that I've got my lock, and I can unlock it, and then it rotates to how I've got my iPhone set up. So lock is 0 now, and the orientation is changing as I rotate around. Lock stays as 0 because I've got it unlocked at the moment. It's also worth noting, I think, that the simulator isn't always perfect with how it handles things, so it's always worth testing on a real device as well. But I'm going to go ahead and set up some new styles here, one for laying out in a row for when it's landscape, and one for laying out in a column for when it's portrait. So I'm just going to go ahead and set up that I want the row to sort of stretch, and I want its item spaced around and centered. And I also want the flex direction to be row so that they're laid out in a row. For my column, the setup's a little bit simpler. I'll go ahead and set that up now. I'm going to go ahead and align my items in the center and also justify content in the center. Now I'm going to go ahead and basically add a conditional dependent on the state of the orientation state variable. So my button layout is going to equal row by default because my default is landscape. But if orientation is set and the orientation is equal to portrait up or portrait down, then I know I can go ahead and display it in a column layout. So I'm going to go ahead and do this now. And I can actually go ahead and make this a little bit more readable, so I'm going to go ahead and do that now. So I can go screen-orientation.orientation.portrait up for one. You can see it's there on the screen. And then I can go ahead and do the same thing, but portrait down for the other orientation value that would cause it to be laid out in a column. So if that's the case, I can go ahead and say button layout is styles.column. Then I'm going to go ahead and apply that style to my button view. And save it. So you can see if I rotate, it puts those buttons into a row when I'm in when I was in the landscape mode. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial today. If you have, please like and subscribe for more content. All my code will be available on GitHub.